In my decades within the walls of Parliament, I have witnessed the rise and fall of ministries, the ebb and flow of public passion, and the eternal struggle between wisdom and folly in human affairs. Yet nothing has impressed upon me more forcefully than this truth, that successful governance is an art, not a science, an art that requires what I call political prudence. This virtue, so often overlooked by those who mistake cleverness for wisdom, stands as the cornerstone of all sound government. While revolutionary enthusiasts promise to remake society according to their abstract theories, and reactionary forces resist all change whatsoever, the prudent statesman navigates between these extremes with the compass of experience. He understands that human affairs are too complex for simple formulas, too rooted in tradition for radical transformation, yet too dynamic for absolute stagnation. Today, as America faces challenges that would test even the wisest of our forebears, the principles of political prudence offer guidance more valuable than any ideological manifesto. For prudence teaches us not merely what to think, but how to think about the delicate balance between preservation and improvement that marks all successful governance. Chapter 1: The Nature of Political Prudence. Political prudence differs fundamentally from the cleverness so prized in our modern age. While cleverness seeks immediate advantage and ideological consistency, prudence seeks the long-term welfare of the Commonwealth through decisions grounded in experience rather than theory. It is, as I have learned through years of parliamentary service, the ability to discern what is possible from what is merely desirable, what is beneficial from what is merely popular. The prudent statesman recognizes that politics is the art of the possible, not because he lacks vision, but because he understands that lasting change must grow organically from existing conditions. When I defended the American colonists against the misguided policies of Lord North's administration, I did so not from abstract principles of liberty, but from the practical understanding that attempting to govern distant peoples through force rather than consent would ultimately prove self-defeating. This same principle guided my opposition to the French Revolution's attempt to reconstruct society from first principles. The revolutionaries possessed clever theories about natural rights and social contracts, but they lacked the prudence to understand that human institutions cannot be demolished and rebuilt like mere buildings. A society is more like a living tree. It may be pruned and carefully shaped, but attempts to tear it up by the roots will only result in its death. Political prudence manifests itself in the statesman's ability to read circumstances accurately. This requires what I might call moral imagination, the capacity to understand how policies will affect not merely the immediate situation, but the complex web of relationships, traditions, and expectations that constitute civil society. The prudent leader asks not simply whether a policy is theoretically just, but whether it can be implemented without destroying the very foundations upon which justice itself depends. Furthermore, prudence teaches us that timing is everything in politics. A reform that might be beneficial if introduced gradually could prove catastrophic if implemented suddenly. The wise statesman studies the temper of his age, understanding when the public mind is prepared for change and when it requires the stability of preservation. He leads public opinion rather than merely following it, but he does so through persuasion and example rather than force. Most importantly, political prudence recognizes that government exists for the people, not the other way around. This means that clever theories must give way to practical results, and ideological purity must yield to the messy compromises necessary for human flourishing. The truly prudent statesman measures his success not by the consistency of his principles, but by the prosperity, liberty, and happiness of those he serves. Chapter 2: Learning from the French Revolutionary Disaster. Nothing has taught me more about the importance of political prudence than witnessing the catastrophic unfolding of events in France. What began as reasonable demands for reform quickly devolved into tyranny precisely because the revolutionaries abandoned prudence for ideology, experience for theory, and gradual improvement for radical transformation. The Assembly's fatal error lay not in recognizing France's need for reform, for indeed, the old regime required substantial changes, but in believing they could reconstruct society according to abstract principles derived from philosophy rather than experience. They possessed what they mistook for wisdom, elaborate theories about natural rights, social contracts, and the perfectibility of human nature. What they lacked was prudence, the understanding that human institutions develop over centuries and cannot be abolished by decree without destroying the social fabric itself. Consider how differently England approached its own constitutional development. Our liberties were not proclaimed in a single moment of revolutionary fervor, but evolved gradually through centuries of struggle, compromise, and adjustment. The Magna Carta, the development of Parliament, the evolution of common law, each represented not a break with the past, but its organic development. This is why English liberty proved durable while French liberty collapsed into despotism. The French revolutionaries' contempt for historical precedent blinded them to essential truths about human nature and social organization. They assumed that destroying existing institutions would automatically create space for better ones, not understanding that institutions embody accumulated wisdom about how human beings can live together peacefully. When they abolished the monarchy, the nobility, and the established church simultaneously, they created a vacuum that could only be filled by force. Their treatment of religion provides a particularly instructive example. Instead of reforming the abuses of the established church while preserving its beneficial role in maintaining social order and public morality, they attempted to replace religious tradition with a cult of reason. This demonstrated a profound misunderstanding of human nature. People require more than rational argument to guide their conduct. They need the moral sentiments cultivated by religious practice and the social bonds created by shared worship. The result, as we have witnessed, was not the triumph of reason but its opposite, the emergence of leaders who appealed to the basest passions of the mob. When traditional authorities were destroyed, they were replaced not by philosopher kings but by demagogues who understood that power flows not from rational argument but from the manipulation of popular emotion. This French experience offers America crucial lessons. Rapid social change, however well-intentioned, risks destroying the delicate bonds that hold society together. The prudent approach to reform recognizes that even flawed institutions serve important social functions and must be changed carefully, with attention to maintaining social cohesion and public order. Chapter 3: The Art of Representation and Leadership. Through my years representing Bristol in Parliament, I learned that true representation requires something far more complex than merely echoing the immediate desires of one's constituents. The representative serves not as a mere delegate, bound to transmit every popular whim, but as a trustee, obligated to exercise his judgment for the benefit of those he represents, even when that judgment conflicts with their expressed preferences. This principle, which I articulated in my famous address to the electors of Bristol, rests upon a crucial distinction between what people want and what they need. The prudent representative understands that popular desires, however sincerely held, may be based on incomplete information, temporary passion, or narrow self-interest. His duty is to discern the true, long-term interests of his constituents and the nation as a whole. Consider how this principle applies to contemporary American politics. The representative who simply follows polling data or the loudest voices in his district abdicates his fundamental responsibility. True leadership requires the moral courage to explain unpopular truths, to resist dangerous enthusiasms, and to champion necessary reforms even when they face initial opposition. But this does not mean the representative should ignore public opinion altogether. Rather, he must engage in what I call the art of political education, shaping public sentiment through reasoned argument and moral example. The people possess fundamental wisdom about their own interests, but they require leadership to understand how those interests connect to broader questions of policy and principle. This relationship between representative and constituents mirrors the larger relationship between leadership and democracy. Democratic government requires more than mere majoritarianism. It requires institutions and practices that channel popular will through the filter of experience and wisdom. The American founders understood this when they created a system of checks and balances, federal structure, and representative rather than direct democracy. The prudent leader recognizes that his authority ultimately derives from popular consent, but he exercises that authority with an eye toward long-term consequences rather than immediate popularity. He understands that true service to the people sometimes requires opposing their expressed desires in order to secure their deeper interests. This creates what I might call the creative tension of democratic leadership. The representative must remain connected to popular sentiment while maintaining sufficient independence to exercise sound judgment. He must be responsive without being merely reactive, principled without being rigidly ideological. Take a moment to consider, how often do we witness leaders who mistake the loudest voices for the wisest counsel? How frequently do we see representatives who confuse popular applause with successful governance? The art of representation requires discernment, the ability to distinguish between genuine public wisdom and mere public clamor. In our current age of instant communication and constant polling, this challenge has only grown more acute. The prudent representative must learn to hear the true voice of his constituents beneath the noise of special interests, ideological activists, and media manipulation. This requires not just political skill, but moral clarity about the purpose of representation itself. Chapter 4: Political Economy and the Wisdom of Markets. My experience with colonial taxation and trade regulation taught me that sound political economy requires the same prudential approach as all successful governance. Abstract theories about markets or state intervention, however elegant, must yield to practical understanding of how economic policies affect real communities and real people. The controversy over American taxation illustrated this principle perfectly. The theoretical question of Parliament's right to tax the colonies mattered less than the practical consequences of exercising that right. A prudent economic policy would have recognized that the wealth of the empire depended upon the prosperity of its parts, and that attempting to extract revenue through measures that damaged trade would ultimately impoverish both the colonies and the mother country. This same principle applies to all questions of political economy. Markets, like other human institutions, develop organically over time and embody accumulated wisdom about how people can cooperate for mutual benefit. The prudent statesman respects this wisdom while recognizing that markets, like all human institutions, require appropriate moral and legal frameworks to function properly. The radical error lies in treating economic systems as machines that can be redesigned according to theoretical blueprints. Markets are not machines but ecosystems, complex networks of relationships, traditions, and expectations that cannot be rebuilt from first principles without destroying their essential character. Yet this does not mean accepting every existing arrangement as sacred or unchangeable. Consider the question of property rights, which I regard as fundamental to any just economic order. Property provides not merely individual security, but the foundation for the independence necessary for genuine citizenship. When people depend entirely upon government for their sustenance, they cannot maintain the independence of judgment necessary for democratic participation. Yet property rights carry corresponding obligations. The great landowner serves as trustee not merely for his own interests, but for the welfare of the community that depends upon his stewardship. This understanding of property as social trust rather than mere individual possession creates space for legitimate regulation while preserving the essential benefits of private ownership. The same prudential approach applies to questions of trade and commerce. Free exchange generally benefits all parties and should be preserved against protectionist schemes that benefit narrow interests at the expense of general prosperity. Yet the statesman must consider how rapid economic changes affect established communities and traditional ways of life. The goal of economic policy should be to preserve what is beneficial in existing arrangements while carefully removing obstacles to improvement. This requires understanding that economic relationships are also social relationships, embedded in particular communities with their own histories and traditions. In our current age of global markets and rapid technological change, this prudential approach becomes even more crucial. Policies that treat workers as mere factors of production, or communities as mere locations for economic activity, ignore the human dimension of economic life. Yet policies that resist all change in the name of preserving traditional communities may condemn those very communities to poverty and decline. The prudent approach seeks to harness the beneficial forces of market competition while maintaining the social bonds and moral framework necessary for human flourishing. This requires not grand theories but careful attention to particular circumstances and their human consequences. Chapter 5: Religion, Morality, and Social Order. Throughout my parliamentary career, I maintain that religion serves as the foundation of civil society, not merely as private comfort for individual souls, but as the essential source of the moral sentiments that make ordered liberty possible. This conviction, unfashionable in our increasingly secular age, rests upon practical observation rather than theological speculation. Human beings require more than legal constraint to live together peacefully. Laws can punish vice after it has occurred, but they cannot create the internal disposition toward virtue that prevents vice from arising. This internal disposition, what we might call moral character, develops through religious practice, which cultivates reverence for divine authority and concern for eternal consequences. The established church, properly understood, serves as a crucial mediating institution between individual conscience and state power. It provides moral education, charitable assistance, and social cohesion while maintaining sufficient independence from government to serve as a check on political excess. When the French revolutionaries destroyed the established church, they eliminated not merely a religious institution but a crucial element of civil society. Yet establishment does not require intolerance. Indeed, the prudent approach to religious diversity recognizes that forced conformity defeats its own purpose. True religious sentiment cannot be compelled by law, and attempts to do so create resentment rather than genuine piety. The wise statesman maintains a religious establishment while tolerating dissent, understanding that the goal is social order rather than theological uniformity. This principle guided my support for Catholic relief measures despite opposition from Protestant zealots who feared that tolerance would undermine religious establishment. I understood that denying basic civil rights to Catholics would create a permanent source of social division, while granting those rights while maintaining Protestant establishment would strengthen rather than weaken social order. The same principle applies to the relationship between religious and secular authority. The established church should support good government while maintaining sufficient independence to criticize bad government. Religious leaders serve their communities best when they address moral questions raised by political issues without becoming mere partisans in political contests. Consider how this wisdom applies to contemporary American debates about religion in public life. The attempt to exclude all religious influence from political discourse ignores the essential role that religious traditions play in shaping moral judgment. Yet the attempt to make government enforce particular religious doctrines violates the principle of religious liberty that protects all faiths. The prudent approach recognizes that religious freedom requires both protection from government interference and acknowledgement of religion's legitimate role in shaping public morality. This means neither the secular extremism that treats religious conviction as purely private prejudice nor the religious extremism that seeks to impose sectarian doctrines through political power. Most importantly, we must understand that moral decline inevitably leads to political decay. A people who lose reverence for divine authority will soon lose respect for human authority as well. Religious practice cultivates the virtues, honesty, temperance, justice, charity, that make self-government possible. Take a moment to reflect. can any society maintain ordered liberty without some shared understanding of moral truth? Can democratic institutions survive when citizens no longer feel moral obligations toward one another? These questions become increasingly urgent as traditional religious influences decline while no adequate secular substitute emerges. The challenge for our time is maintaining the beneficial social effects of religious tradition while respecting the genuine diversity of religious conviction that characterizes modern society. This requires wisdom, patience, and careful attention to the delicate balance between unity and diversity that marks all successful commonwealths. Chapter 6: Empire, Federation, and Decentralized Governance. My involvement in colonial affairs taught me that successful governance of diverse peoples requires understanding the crucial distinction between empire and federation. Empire seeks to impose uniform control from a central authority, while federation preserves local autonomy within a framework of shared principles and mutual obligations. The American crisis demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of confusing these two models. The British government's attempt to treat the American colonies as mere extensions of the home islands violated fundamental principles of prudent governance. Peoples separated by geography, circumstance, and historical experience cannot be governed effectively through detailed regulations issued from distant capitals. Successful administration of diverse territories requires what I call local knowledge, understanding of particular conditions that can only be possessed by those who live under them. This principle explains why my proposals for colonial reconciliation emphasized American self-governance within the imperial framework rather than either complete independence or complete subjugation. I understood that the empire's strength lay not in uniformity but in diversity united by common allegiance and mutual interest. The same principle applies to governance within individual nations. Centralized administration, however well-intentioned, cannot possibly possess the detailed knowledge necessary for effective local government. Different regions face different challenges, possess different resources, and maintain different traditions that must be respected rather than steamrolled by national policies. Consider how federal systems, properly designed, can preserve both unity and diversity. The American Constitution, despite its flaws, demonstrates how central authority can handle genuinely national concerns, defense, foreign relations, interstate commerce, while leaving local matters to local governments. This division of responsibilities reflects not mere political convenience but deep wisdom about the proper scope of different types of authority. Yet federalism requires more than mere constitutional structure. It requires what we might call federal sentiment, the disposition to seek local solutions to local problems while maintaining loyalty to the larger community. This sentiment develops through practice rather than proclamation, as people learn to govern themselves effectively at the local level while cooperating with neighboring communities for common purposes. The modern tendency toward centralization, whether in government administration or economic organization, threatens this federal balance. When important decisions affecting local communities are made by distant bureaucrats who lack local knowledge, the result is usually both inefficiency and resentment. People naturally resist being governed by those who neither understand nor care about their particular circumstances. This principle has profound implications for contemporary American governance. The federal government's assumption of responsibilities traditionally handled by states and localities creates what I call the problem of scale, attempting to apply uniform solutions to diverse situations that require different approaches. The prudent approach to governance recognizes that different types of problems require different types of solutions. Some challenges, national defense, constitutional rights, interstate commerce, genuinely require national action. But most questions of daily governance, education, local economic development, community services, are better handled by those closest to the problems. This does not mean abandoning all national standards or allowing harmful local practices to continue unchecked. Rather, it means understanding that effective governance requires the right level of authority for each type of problem. The art lies in discerning which issues truly require central direction and which benefit from local autonomy. Moreover, successful federation requires what I call the principle of subsidiarity, the presumption that problems should be solved at the most local level capable of handling them effectively. This principle respects both human dignity and practical efficiency by keeping decisions as close as possible to those affected by them. The challenge for our time is recovering this federal wisdom while addressing genuinely national problems that require coordinated action. This requires statesmanship that can distinguish between true national needs and the mere convenience of central control. Chapter 7: Applying Burkean Wisdom to Contemporary America. As I observe contemporary American politics through the lens of centuries of accumulated wisdom, I see both tremendous opportunities and serious dangers. America possesses institutional advantages that most nations lack: a written constitution that has proven adaptable over time, a federal system that balances unity with diversity, and civic traditions that encourage both individual achievement and community responsibility. Yet these advantages require constant cultivation to remain effective. The greatest threat to American constitutional government lies not in any particular policy or party, but in the growing tendency to treat politics as warfare rather than the art of governing free people. When political opponents become enemies to be destroyed rather than fellow citizens with different views, the essential bonds of civil society begin to fray. This development would have been familiar to me from observing the French Revolution's descent from reform to terror. The prudent approach to contemporary political divisions recognizes that persistent disagreements often reflect genuine tensions that cannot be resolved through simple formulas. The tension between individual liberty and social order, between national unity and local autonomy, between tradition and progress, these are permanent features of political life that require ongoing balance rather than final resolution. Consider how Burkean principles might guide American responses to current challenges. The question of economic inequality, for instance, requires neither the socialists' desire to reconstruct society according to egalitarian principles nor the libertarians' faith that market forces alone will produce just outcomes. The prudent approach examines how particular policies affect both economic efficiency and social cohesion, seeking reforms that preserve beneficial aspects of existing arrangements while addressing genuine problems. Similarly, questions of immigration and national identity require balancing America's generous tradition of welcoming newcomers with the practical need to maintain social cohesion and civic culture. This means neither the restrictionists' fear of all foreign influence nor the cosmopolitans' indifference to national boundaries, but thoughtful policies that encourage integration while preserving what makes America worth joining. The application of Burkean wisdom to contemporary America must begin with recovery of civic virtue, the disposition to place long-term community welfare above immediate personal advantage. This virtue cannot be mandated by law but must be cultivated through the mediating institutions that stand between individual and state, families, churches, voluntary associations, local communities. These institutions have suffered serious erosion in recent decades, weakened by both market forces that treat everything as commodity and government policies that assume bureaucratic solutions to social problems. Strengthening civil society requires policies that support rather than supplant these organic forms of social organization. The challenge of technological change illustrates the need for prudential responses to unprecedented problems. New technologies create new possibilities for both human flourishing and human degradation, but they do so within the context of unchanging human nature. The wise approach neither embraces every innovation uncritically nor rejects all change defensively, but asks how new capabilities can be directed toward genuinely human ends. Most importantly, contemporary America requires leadership that understands the difference between governing and campaigning. The skills necessary for winning elections, appealing to partisan bases, simplifying complex issues, promising immediate solutions, often conflict directly with the skills necessary for governing, building coalitions, managing trade-offs, accepting partial solutions. This suggests the need for what I might call institutional reforms that encourage longer-term thinking and bipartisan cooperation. These might include changes in electoral systems, congressional procedures, and media practices that currently reward polarization and punish moderation. Yet ultimately, the application of Burkean wisdom to contemporary problems requires something that cannot be mandated by institutional design: the cultivation of prudential judgment among both leaders and citizens. This judgment develops through practice, through engaging with real problems that require balancing competing goods rather than choosing between obvious alternatives. The great advantage of American democracy lies in its capacity for self-correction through peaceful means. But this capacity requires citizens who understand that democratic participation involves more than expressing preferences. It requires taking responsibility for consequences. Conclusion. The art of political prudence, as I have learned through decades of parliamentary service and careful observation of human affairs, offers no simple formulas or easy answers. It requires instead the patient cultivation of wisdom that comes only through experience, reflection, and genuine care for the welfare of one's fellow citizens. In our age of rapid change and ideological passion, this ancient virtue becomes more precious than ever. The temptation to solve complex problems through simple theories, to remake society according to abstract principles, or to resist all change in the name of tradition, these temptations have never been stronger. Yet the consequences of yielding to them have never been more dangerous. The prudent statesman understands that his highest calling is not to implement his own vision of the good society, but to serve as trustee for institutions and traditions that belong not to any single generation but to the great chain of being that connects past, present, and future. This requires humility before the complexity of human affairs and reverence for the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors. Yet prudence is not mere conservatism in the narrow sense of opposing all change. Rather, it is the wisdom to distinguish between changes that strengthen the fabric of society and those that threaten to tear it apart. It seeks to preserve what is beneficial while carefully removing what is harmful, understanding that the goal is not stasis but healthy growth. For America today, this means recovering the civic virtues that make self-government possible while adapting inherited institutions to contemporary challenges. It means choosing leaders who understand that governing requires more than winning elections, and citizens who understand that freedom requires more than the absence of restraint. The choice before us is not between tradition and progress, but between prudent reform and destructive revolution. May we choose wisely.